I would like to start out by just getting you to tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe something that we don't necessarily know about you, a bit about your own, your own story, your own personal life.
Thanks. One of the things that really excites me is just that interaction between sort of the academic world and being able to, really explore and research the Bible and theology, but also connecting it to the local church. Because for me, it has no purpose if it doesn't connect with real life and with the real, with the grassroots of the church. So one of the things about, well, you all probably know I did missions work in Turkey as well. One of the things you may not know about me, because this is only kind of a recent development, is I've also started being involved in some ecumenical dialogues, which is working with other church groups to be able to have to understand them and for them to understand us as the Pentecostal church. And so that's been a really exciting development that I've been enjoying. So I've been trying to do that at a grassroots level as well. So particularly with the Catholic Church. So been connecting with some local groups here with the Bishop of Bathurst and some of the local groups around Parramatta region as well. But I'll also be involved in an international dialogue representing Pentecostalism from Asia Pacific in the next month at the Vatican. So that's really exciting. Yeah.
That sounds fantastic. I was thinking about this earlier, and I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and I was always kind of, I don't know, looked down upon a little bit by everyone else in any other kind of church, because other churches seem to have other styles of church, like the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, Presbyterian Church, had a bit more of a heritage of academic rigor. And as a Pentecostal, I kind of got, laughed at a little bit, like we were kind of like the poor cousins when it came to academic study. I mean, have you seen that in your time? I mean, as Pentecostal as well, and if so, it's not so much the case now. We've got a great university college now. We're building something of academic rigor into our movement. But have you seen that, and then have you seen any benefits in the work that we've done to kind of become a little bit more academic as a movement?
Yes to both. So I guess similar to you, I've had the experience of being the poor cousin, the hillbilly kind of Pentecostal person, and that still exists in some circles. So for example, there's a really big biblical studies conference in the US. It's an international one, but it's based in the US and been around for a long time. Pentecostals are still not welcome because they're scared we'll speak in tongues at the meeting or something like that. Like it's just crazy. So and yet there's so many Pentecostals that are part of that group and contribute, but we have to be, in a sense, not identify ourselves as a group of Pentecostals. And so there's still suspicion. We're still considered sort of really hick scholars in a sense. So we don't really do the real thing. But I think over the last sort of 20 years, there has been a shift within that. And particularly the last 10 years, we've seen an increase in Pentecostal scholarship. And what that has looked like is previously Pentecostals attended the different institutions of the other denominations. So we went to the Catholic colleges, we went to the Anglican colleges for our education, including myself. So I was at Charles Sturt Uni, and so my studies have been done through St Mark's Anglican College and the United Theological College in Parramatta. And so we didn't have anything where I could study. And so we're only now kind of developing our own pathways and institutions. And so what that meant is that, so for people such as myself, our formation as scholars was around their traditions and their understandings of the Bible. But since then, scholars from Pentecostal traditions have been able to say, well, that's really helpful, it's rich, thank you. But our heritage actually has a lot to offer. And Pentecostals have a lot to offer in terms of an understanding of the Spirit that is just not there in the studies and in the academic work of the other traditions. Maybe Catholics a bit more, but certainly not in the others. And so I think there's been a developing understanding and a lot of work among Pentecostal scholars to help us really enrich the understanding of the broader church, but also for Pentecostals as well. So, for example, what does it mean to be a church? For us, a central part of that is that we're a gathering of believers who are empowered by the Holy Spirit, and we're gifted by the Holy Spirit. Even hearing some of your different stories, you're talking about, in a sense, the Spirit guiding the church, the Spirit gifting individuals within the church, and being led by the Spirit, the sense of the Spirit being present in the meeting. And that's actually a distinctive of Pentecostals that is not necessarily shared in other traditions, and yet it has such a huge it's a huge blessing. It's a huge area that we want to really be able to encourage and cultivate in our churches. Like that's, if we don't have the Holy Spirit, who are we as a church? And that's just not Pentecostals either. And so to really enrich the church and to connect, I guess, our study of what is the church. It's the gathering of the believers. It's the gathering, the place where the Spirit gathers amongst the church, the believers, but also the Spirit at work outside the church, drawing people, convicting them, the Spirit of truth, convicting the world, and our cooperation with the Spirit in that. And so I just think there's a whole lot that we bring to the wider church, not just as academics, but you as practitioners as well. You on the ground doing the work, and being able to really enrich both the church and the world through what we do. And so I think there's a huge amount, and it's only just beginning really in terms of Pentecostal scholarship and development in that
That's
area.
exciting.
And
yeah, I mean, you would have to be on the forefront of that development, Jacqui, for sure. I mean, the amount of the contributions that you've made into that academic space from our movement. I mean, it's you should absolutely be commended for that, and it's helped churches practically, which is just phenomenal. It's empowered us, and it's emboldened us to be, Pentecostal, and and also in a way that is almost legitimizes our position, which is nice.
Absolutely, and to be confident in that, I think that's the other thing that, and that links to women as well. So that idea, the Spirit empowers all people, young, old. It's the 15-year-old who shares communion. That's just excited and empowered by the Spirit. Like that's the whole point of it, and being confident that yes, this is valid. Because other traditions would look down on that and say, you've got a child, or you've got a woman, you've got someone who's not educated, or and be able to say, well, actually, it's about the Holy Spirit empowering people, no matter their background, their ethnicity, their gender, their age. It's the Spirit empowering, and we're together encouraging that giftedness. And so, it's a really important aspect of who we are, but also that we can be confident in this as well, which I hope is what, as scholars, we gift to the church, that confidence.
Absolutely. And you touched on a topic there that some churches that have a rich history of academic rigor tend to disagree with, I think, what would be at least the written position of our movement of churches when it comes to gender equality. And you've even, you've written and been published on this area of gender equality for church leaders and churches. And so, and the thing that I find so interesting about that is that in the life of the church, there seems to be almost two camps, and we haven't quite settled on the issue when it comes to women in leadership. But the rest of the world's kind of moved on, and they're quite happy just to embrace, gender equality in that space. I mean, I would love to know what you think is the issue there. Like, why is the church lagging? Why are there two, from an academic point of view, maybe, why are there two really different points of view when it comes to women leading, whether teaching, men preaching? I mean, it does seem to be, it's almost like it's a dichotomy there. Like, why is that? Why is the church, seemingly to me, got it so wrong, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two things. I think there's the theology, and then there's the culture within churches. And so theologically, churches have struggled to understand some of the scriptures, and what they've tended to do is pull out a few, two verses essentially, and focused on them. And they're verses that they've read as restricting women from from ministry and leadership and teaching. So, for example, the Timothy passage about women not having authority, and Corinthians passage, and they've highlighted those passages and not read it within the context of the Bible, in which we see God using women all throughout the biblical text. We see in the book of Acts, God using women, and Paul emphasizing the ministry of women. And so I find it quite ironic that these different church traditions will read Timothy who's in Ephesus. So Timothy, who was essentially, had the church was previously pastored by Priscilla and Aquila, and it was always Priscilla as the notable one amongst that couple. And so they would say, well, women can't have authority, when Priscilla was actually teaching and held authoritative positions in the church. It's like, read Timothy in context of Acts, how it's meant to be. But I think that those passages have been taken and highlighted, taken out of context actually, and highlighted by scholars and within the tradition. And there's a strong held, entrenched tradition in that theology. And to be honest, I think it's spiritual as well, because the enemy doesn't want the church to flourish. And if you can withhold the activity of half the church, then you've got a limping church. You've got a church flying with one wing, and not both. And it's not soaring with both wings. And so, so that it's theological, but to me, there's also really a bit of a spiritual activity behind that, not behind those people, or sorry, not those people, but behind the views that those people have taken. The other thing is linked to that is culture. So church culture has grown up for hundreds of years. So you've kind of got the early church where men and women worked together, it was flourishing, and then you have the institutionalization of the church when it gets connected with the Roman Empire. And so it's just simple things like, for a church to be a church and not a temple, it had to be located then in the Roman buildings, political buildings, where women were not allowed. And so suddenly you don't have women allowed in the actual church, to have office or to have a leadership role. And so then it becomes the decline of women. And so as soon as we sort of tether Christianity to a culture and the cultural expressions, it gets messed up. And so we see then culturally, then for generations, women haven't been involved in leadership. We see different pockets throughout church history where different groups have emerged, and different amazing women. There's a whole lot of women in the medieval period who were doing great things, but there's generally sort of a culture where women were not allowed, and that becomes entrenched in the practices, and it becomes normal then. And so I think that where our world and our churches are sort of beginning to see that actually, let's read the Bible more carefully, and let's actually, look back in history, and there's wonderful things we can retrieve and that help us from our history, but there's also some things we haven't done so well, and let's learn from that as well. And that includes how, sort of women have not been treated equally. And so, and I think it's getting back to the biblical basics in a sense.
Yeah, who would have thought that the heyday for women in ministry would have been in the medieval times? Eh? If you could go back in history, where would you like to go? Oh, yeah, I wouldn't have picked that as my first.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go back. Quite happy with today's.
Well, let's fast forward then. Let's not go backwards. Let's move into the future. Starting from today on, I mean, post-pandemic church is, in my experience, and from the pastors and leaders that I talk to, things have changed. Like, this isn't the same landscape in church world. And, for our leaders listening, we know that things aren't the same as they were in November, December 2019. The world's changed, and therefore, society's changed. And, we were talking about earlier, people just getting their lives together, and it's the middle of 2022. So there's still this ripple effect, and and what I've observed is that it's changed the way that we function as a society. And so people are reevaluating their lives, they're resetting. And so I guess what I wanted to ask you, Jacqui, coming from your perspective, is maybe from a personal reflection. Like, are you doing that in your own life? Are you kind of reevaluating and possibly resetting, your focus and your attention, your priorities, and following from that, if you could reevaluate and possibly restart church, if you had the power just to almost plant a church today, what do you think churches in this post-pandemic world should really hold as high values and really be looking at and focusing on? And again, bringing all of your learning and all of your academic study to bear on that question. Like, you could just start from scratch, knowing that let's say you knew you couldn't fail. What would church look like for Pastor Jacqui Gray post-pandemic?
Yes, great question. So from the personal perspective, I have been reevaluating sort of my own role and what I do. So I moved back from Turkey at the beginning of 2019. And when I came back, it was to a particular position as the Dean of Theology, which was heavily loaded with administration and management tasks, which I wasn't enamored with. I can do, I'm competent in, but it's not my great love.
Yeah.
And some people love it, and all power to them, and they should be doing that. Not those who suffer through it. And so I came back and I agreed to it and said, look, I'll do it. It's not my dream job, but I'll do it till we can raise someone up to take over from that. And so at the end of last year, I had been working with an associate dean who was then taking over and they restructured more generally the college anyway. And so I said, I would like to demote myself to focus on teaching and research and to supervision. I mean, it's like many professions, the teachers, the nurse. If you're a good teacher, if you're a good nurse, you get promoted to administration and you're no longer nursing. So the same thing. I wanted to focus on what I loved, which was teaching and research, and so and sticking to that lane. And so part of it is just identifying gifts, personal gifts and talents, and focusing on that, but also about releasing others who have that gift and talent. Because I felt if I stayed in that position, I would actually be blocking someone else from rising up in that leadership, someone who was passionate about administration and management. And so it was a win-win as far as I was concerned. In terms of then, if I could reset church in this season, I guess one thing that Turkey really showed me, which reinforced, I think, some of my experiences involved in university ministry for many years, was the emphasis on community. And I think that's what people are craving for, and what we've really lacked in the pandemic. It's not rocket science, isn't it? We've all been isolated, and actually returning back to community. But I think we have to relearn how to do community, because we've been so isolated. Like, it's not just sort of stick people in a building, but it's building together. And that's why, Beck, hearing about your service on Sunday, you're right. It's not about the numbers, but it's about the atmosphere and just the community that's built amongst those people, and that's exactly it. And so I'm hearing a lot of talk about discipleship among Pentecostal churches, but most of the time, to be honest, it's people, it's leaders going, pastors going, let's do discipleship. We're going to do a 6-week teaching series on discipleship. That's not discipleship. We need teaching on it, sure, but discipleship is doing, and it's actually really about getting that small group together and focusing on relationships. And so when I was in Turkey, one of my experiences was Turkish hospitality and banquets and meals, and they were really important. And I'd love to see more of that, particularly in multicultural Australia, just gathering around a meal. And a meal will go for 3 or 4 hours, just sitting, eating, sharing, learning about one another's family, and you go deep. I think in the first month of that in Turkey, I learned more about the people I was working with than what I knew about my colleagues at college that I'd known for 10 years. So you really go deep. And so I think deeper relationship and that relational connection, community, and doing life together is so important. And I think the other reset, is just exactly what you're doing, finding opportunities for short, sharp, Zoom style meetings where you can connect up, and it doesn't have to take 3-4 hours because
Yeah.
you're online. You can't do that. And so having both and actually
Mm,
really working with the technology that's available as well, and so
mm,
utilizing the best of what we've got. But I think building community is a really relational community is something that is what I would focus on
mm.
if I was planting a church
Yeah,
here
great.
in
Well,
Australia.
so what do you think, Jacqui? Do you think planning a church is on the horizon?
Um, Not in the next little next few years, but maybe in the future. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.